Hi everyone, welcome to the Fit by SOS Influencing Coders of Power, also known as IFOP. So my name is Risham. I work as part of the research team as an intern. So this morning we're hosting the launch of Baroness Bennett's new book, Tech Will Change Everything. Natalie Bennett joined the Green Party in 2006 and was elected as a leader of the Green Party for Northern Wales in 2012 and was re-elected in 2014. Natalie is joined by Divya Talwar, who is an investigative journalist and reporter for the BBC. She's reported for BBC Newsnight, Panorama, and Radio 4. So thank you for being here, guys.
Thank you. Natalie, so let's make this interactive. So if I'm talking or Natalie's saying something, you've got a question, just raise your hand. You don't need to wait till the end for that. So Natalie, you know I'm a journalist. I'm always looking for a story. Tell me the story behind your book.
Oh, the story behind the book sort of has two stages. The first of all was that in 2012, I'd been editor of the Guardian Weekly for 5 years. I was about to take voluntary redundancy, and I planned to have a lovely year off, baking vegetables, growing vegetables, baking bread, and writing a book. And it was going to be called Our Economic and Environmental Crisis and How We Get Out of It. And then Caroline Lucas rang me up and said, I'm not re-standing for Green Party leader. And I put the phone down and said, oh, hell. And so 10 years ago, the book wasn't written. But now we got to the stage where actually Jenny Jones, my fellow Green peer, asked me, I know this senior police officer who wants to know more about Green political philosophy. What book should I tell them to read? And I said, there isn't really a book. I suppose I better write it. So that's the story behind it. But the contents really are, I've been going around the country for 10 years, talking at public meetings, talking to everything from the Women's Institute to the Year 6 at a North Yorkshire primary, getting ideas off them, bouncing ideas off them, seeing how people react to things. In some ways, this book is a boil down those talks, all of those talks. So I say it's kind of co-created because lots of it's got lots of the stories that people have told me. Those are the things that have gone into the book. So I felt there was a need, and essentially the book was sitting there in my head, in my experiences of a dozen years. So all I had to do was put it down on paper. It sounds very simple when you say it quickly.
Do you think now's the right time for it?
Absolutely, because I think we've had, I don't believe in perfect cycles of history, but we've had 40 years of neoliberalism, neo-Thatcherism, call it what you like. The idea that greed is good, inequality doesn't matter, we can keep trashing the planet. And that comes after 40 years of a social democratic consensus, where, you know, it's worth remembering this, that both Tories and Labour for 40 years believed in state ownership of coal mines and car factories and even railways. And there was a family wage. One person, a man, was usually then was expected to earn enough money to support a wife and a couple of kids. So we had 40 years of social democracy. We've had 40 years of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has clearly failed now. It's now falling apart. I mean, one of the things that I often point to is the Financial Times. Everyone's talking about sewage and water companies now, but actually for years, the Financial Times has been going, gosh, this is a real disaster. The sewage companies have really broken things apart, and this is going really badly. And so even the intelligent end of the current system can see that what we have now is not working. So people are really looking around for what comes next in terms of political philosophies. And that's really difficult because at the moment, people have lost faith in politics. One of the problems is the University of Northumbria did a really excellent study on universal basic income, which is the first chapter of the book. And they got ordinary members of the public, non-political people in to talk about universal basic income. And they said to them, explained it all and said, what do you think? And almost universally they said, it sounds like a brilliant idea, but it's never going to happen because politics doesn't change anything. So what we've had, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's seemed to be only one kind of politics in town. There's not been a political competition. And it was just a matter of having that politics and, who would manage it better. So we've really got to inspire people with the idea that politics can and must change things. And behind this is the understanding there's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life, for us to share them out, if we share them out fairly. That's perfectly possible. It's doable. Human beings are wonderful, creative, capacity. I was only tweeting yesterday, we actually got up, Homo erectus, 400,000 years ago, got up and lived in Siberia. And no one thought that was possible. human beings are amazing. We can be creative. The idea that this is the only thing, what we have now is the only thing that's possible, really doesn't add up. So it's a time to offer people hope and alternative.
The book title is obviously ambitious, change everything. But if you could change one thing, what do you think is your priority?
Well, I mean, I've already mentioned universal basic income. I think that's crucial. But the second chapter is education. There's probably not many political books where education is the second chapter. Or indeed, there's a whole chapter even on education. But I think one of the problems we have to unleash that human creativity, the potential at the moment, particularly in the UK, we have an education system that's designed for exams. I was talking to a lot of schools and colleges, and I was talking to a community group, and a teacher came up to me and said, "Oh, what you said, I so about education, it should be for life, not exams. I'm just going day after day running mock SATs exams with my pupils. We're spending a large part of our education time teaching people to do exams. And what we need to do instead is to unleash people's capacity, their creativity. We're squashing so many people in our education system. I mean, I went to Molescombe Academy in Hackney last week, and pupils walking along the corridors in silence. They're not allowed, they'll get a detention if they open their mouth. They're lined up, and you can understand why you line 5-year-olds up to keep them in order, but we're talking 15-year-olds start in the morning lined up in the playground. And that's what our education system is doing to people. So what we have to do is free up that educational, and of course allow education for life. And I have to say, since we're here in SOAS, abolish university tuition fees. Education is a public good. It should be paid for from general public taxation, not a huge weight on people's shoulders. And like so many policies at the moment, the whole tuition fees is actually a fiction, because more than 50% of it will never be paid back. They're supposed to be loans, but actually they're not loans. The whole thing is this giant fiction. Our universities are built on this whole failed model, like they're and what are universities for? Community of scholars adding to the amount of human knowledge, or so you can get a well-paying job, so you can pay back the loan that you got to get the well-paying job. There's something basically fundamentally wrong there. So education as a foundation is one of the places we have to start. And this is a long answer, but something I'm very passionate about. Many years ago, when I was a boss, I had a member of staff who was in debt, and it was affecting her work. And so I had the excuse to sit down and counsel her and talk about her shopping habit, because she was in serious debt. But every lunchtime she'd come back with a bag with a couple of new t-shirts in it. And the weekend, everyone talked about work, talk about what they do at the weekend. She'd talk about when she went shopping at the weekend. So I sat her down and said, okay, perhaps you should think about finding something else to do with your spare time, and that might help your debt problem. And between us, we couldn't think of anything that she could think of to do in her spare time other than go shopping.
Oh.
And, we've destroyed creative education in schools, things like music and arts. She'd never learnt to read for pleasure. You only read to get through exams. And she just didn't know how else to spend her time other than go shopping.
How do we change that then? Because I'm sure a lot of teachers, maybe even students as well, will agree that there is this huge emphasis on exams. I mean, schools are rated on, how many A to C's they get at GCSE. How does that change? That's been ingrained in our education system for so long.
Well, I think, the start of the book talks about 3 fallacies, and one of the fallacies is the idea that we have to found everything on competition, so that, people competing against each other, institutions competing against each other. Universities have spent vast amounts of money on new shiny buildings, so that they can attract foreign students because they're competing against each other, and competing against Canada or whatever. So let's end school league tables. When the Greens were running Brighton and Hove Council, albeit as a minority administration, we had a really good head of education who said to all the schools, right, you're not competing against each other. We're here to get the best result for every single pupil. and was actually successful in significantly lifting GCSE results, which had always been bad in Brighton. Now that's a bad target, but behind that was lots of pupils who weren't getting expelled, who weren't being treated badly, who were actually finding some way to flourish. And so we have to do the rethinking. I think we also have to build things from the ground up. I mean, not very far from here, there's a new university that's starting up, or a new school, the new school of the Anthropocene. And they do a 1-year certificate, and it's built entirely on a different model. I went and did a seminar with them. Admittedly, the academics are also based at other institutions as well, but they're trying to pioneer different ways, much lower cost ways of doing things, and get back to that model of a community of scholars, of people from all kinds of different levels.
Has any country or place tried that?
Well,
Abolishing the league tables, scrapping that.
Well, some places have never had them. I mean, and it was quite amusing, really. I did a launch of the book with Ian Dale from LBC on a talkback show, and you can find this out there in social media land. And I was talking about, Green Party want to abolish SATs, want to abolish Ofsted, want to make much more coursework in high school, etc. And Ian slightly reflexively said, "Oh, that's radical green ideas. No one's going to agree with that." And he got absolutely hammered by his listenership, calls, texts, phone-ins, and one of the places that everyone says is the best education system in the world is Finland. And Finland doesn't operate on that competitive model. They're working to get the best for every pupil. I mean, other things is Finland, like most of Europe, doesn't start formal education until age 7. One of the problems with our system is starting, at children 4.5. Right, and again, it's this discipline. Sitting down there, hold your pen, be quiet for half an hour and don't move. And lots of children are not ready to do that at that stage. They get labelled as failures. And just think about what we're doing with 5-year-olds being told they're not good enough, they're failures. And we've all known, I'm sure we've all been through this with school, with kids who are just, have always been told they're failures. They usually end up as rebels, quite often end up expelled, etc. So again, one of the broader things that we totally need to rethink is I'm forever running into politicians from other parties who say, we have to create more jobs. Has anyone noticed that we're short 100,000 carers and 50,000 nurses, and that every shop you go round out here will have a help wanted sign in the window? We have an ageing population. The birth rate's falling off a cliff. Those are global figures. We have to care for, value, nourish, allow to flourish every human being we've got, because we need to regard human energy as a scarce resource and use it well and develop it well. Sorry, I've got a long way from the start, wherever the start was. Oh, I know, league tables and that. So we have to move away from that idea of competition. We have to move to the idea of every child. And, talking about the Molscombe school, they've got carefully graded classes, and they test them every quarter, and pupils get promoted or demoted every quarter.
What age are the pupils?
That's high school, so 11 or so.
Right, okay. Wow. Well, another thing you're really passionate about, and you obviously your first.
Sorry, I think there was a question over there. Sorry,
sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, it's not asking one. I was just going to ask about on education, what the Green Party policy is on private education. If you're talking about abolishing league tables.
Yeah, we would basically. I mean, they're not charities. I mean, very weirdly, last week, I was both at Moulscombe and at Eton. I was doing a debate with Lord Billamoria on nuclear energy at Eton. My life has lots of variety in it. The boys, some of the pupils were showing me around, the chapel and everything. And I kind of said to them, so this did actually, they were talking about the founding and Henry VI and everything. And I said, so this did start as a charity school for poor boys, didn't it? And they kind of went, yeah. So they're not charities. They shouldn't have any tax breaks. They are commercial enterprises. They should be treated entirely as commercial enterprises. Interestingly, as the Green Party, I was actually at the conference where we debated whether we should simply ban them altogether. But the practical reality is that they would just go offshore. it doesn't really work as a practical option. But they are not charities. They should get no tax breaks, no advantages. And I think that that they will say, and you hear debates about this because this is sort of half Labor policy. Labor goes half the way that we do on this. And people say, well, some of them will close down. Well, I'm afraid, I'm really worried for the pupils who were at the school at that time. But other than that,
They'd close down if they lost charitable status.
yeah. I mean, it's generally agreed that quite a few would, because, undoubtedly, and I also want to stress that, I don't blame individual parents. People do what the best they want for their own children. But it's bad for the whole of society. And that whole competing, I mean, I used to be a governor at Natalie Primary, which is just north of the Regent Park Tube. And, there was a Church of England school on one side of the estate and us on the other side of the estate. And there was a total social division of the Church of England school was seen as the best school. And, if you'd equalise the groups between the two, you would have a much better mix of parents, much more people able to contribute to the school and mix together.
I mean, that's a really good question. Private schools do seem to be flourishing. And I know personally a lot of people that have their children in state schools, and there is overcrowding, and they will put all their resources into private schools.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems is, they are actually a parasite sucking both pupils and resources out. But, I mean, what we need, of course, is far more resources in state schools. You look at the class sizes in private schools versus the class sizes in fee-paying schools. I just cannot, this is the Australian origins, I cannot call them public schools. It just seems such a weird label. Fee-paying schools, we'll call them. So it's a real issue for the whole of society. And it's also not equipping people. Those private schools don't equip people to live in the world because they're nothing like the real world.
They also don't equip. They equip certain people to lead and other people not to be able to as well.
Well, I've got a slightly joking line, which is I think that we should ban anyone from Eton from being in the cabinet until we get to the point where the number of cabinet members and prime ministers who've been to Eton balances the amount of population, which will keep us going for the next 10 centuries or go so anyway with no more people from Eton.
What are the numbers on that, Natalie? Let's test you.
Oh, I have another. Well,
Oxford or Eton.
I haven't got total figures on that, but obviously Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Rishi Sunak, and a case study for people whose name you as a journalist probably won't know, but recently the House of Lords, there was a bill called the Importation of Hunting Trophies Bill, which would have pretty well does what it says on the tin, and all the parties backed it. It went right through the Commons with total agreement. It got to the House of Lords and it was filibustered by 12 male Tory peers, 9 of whom went to Eton. So, this simple, very small, modest little measure, the Eton Old Boys Network came out. And, I don't think any of them have ever been ministers or anything. They're just backbench Tory peers, although one of them very curiously has since been made a whip, which is very strange. But anyway, yes. So, and I mean, it's interesting because this is just the week that I've had, but I also, the weird thing is I actually went to a private school in Australia. That was because I got a scholarship. I wouldn't have gone otherwise. We had an event, I hosted an event for the old girls. And we were talking there about how the old girls network, even from fee-paying schools, doesn't have the same kind of impact as the old boys network. And it's interesting, and we think about so much, I mean, we're getting onto, I've been a feminist since age 5, so we were bound to get into feminism at some stage or another. So much of our rhetoric around sports, so much of our discussion about public life uses sporting metaphors. And boys, particularly through team sports, are taught to stick together and always be part of the team. And girls, again, very often are taught to compete against each other. And there's not that same kind of, we're all in the scrum together kind of cuddle thing. So, you know, there's gender aspects in all of this as well.
Absolutely. Another thing you're clearly very passionate about is this idea of a universal basic income. You alluded to that. Have any of you read the book and familiar with that concept? For those that are not, can you just tell us what you mean by universal basic income?
Well, it's not just me. I mean, it's a very widely understood category that's getting lots of interest. And for example, Wales is currently running a trial, really interesting trial, where they're giving universal basic income to care leavers. And Ireland, Republic of Ireland, is doing a really interesting trial where they're giving it to creative people, artists, and that to enable them to pursue their art. So a UBI. The clue's in the name, universal. It goes to everyone who's accepted a member of this society. It's a basic income, so it meets your basic needs. So no one has to worry about putting food on the table, keeping a roof over your head. And you get that for life. When you get to a certain age, you get a pension that's higher than now, but sticking to sort of people of a working age. No criteria for fulfill. Just you are a member of this society, you get the payment every week to meet your basic needs. So that means no one has to worry about putting food on the table, keeping a roof over their head. And the foundational argument for this actually was established just up the road. I was at the British Library. There was an exhibition on human rights 10, or probably more than that, 15 years ago now. And they were talking about, you know, human rights. Everyone accepts the right to life. I mean, even in the House of Lords, I think I'd probably get pretty well everyone to agree a right to life, even the most right-wing people. But we don't actually, in our society now, guarantee that people will have an income, whether you've got 0 hours contracts, benefit sanctions, and a right to life implies a right to food, a right to shelter, a right to some basic protective clothing, etc., etc. So I would say that UBI is a human right. But more than that, and this actually developed from, I was talking to a amazing 17-year-old Polish climate striker and UBI campaigner. We happened to be in Italy, and he was saying to me that, you know, he was campaigning for UBI in Poland, but it was really tough because it sort of felt like people thought it was like socialism and no one wanted to go back to socialism. And he said, you know, how do I explain this to people? And it really was working through with him that I realized what I think is the strongest argument for UBI, which is that most of us now have a boss who tells us how to spend most of our time, energy, and talents. And we all know that we've got lots of bosses who don't tell us how to spend our time, energy, and talents well, or the system forces that. Under the old socialist system, the state told people how to spend their time, energy, and talents. A UBI means that you as an individual can decide how to spend your time, energy, and talents. So, you know, people ask me what's a bad thing about a UBI society. Well, you probably get lots of bad poetry written. Lots of people would decide that they wanted to be a poet. But, you know, to be serious for a second, you'd also get some wonderful poetry written that doesn't get written now because that poet is stuck in a horrible call centre 40 hours a week. We're all having to speak to the person stuck in that horrible call centre for 40 hours a week. No one wins. Yeah, music composed. And you know, one of the things that terrifies, we were talking about economics, it terrifies mainstream economists about this, is it's really hard to predict how people would behave. But one of the things you've done, we were talking about trials, is actually most of the trials going back to when this was trialled in Canada in the 1970s. Remember, we were in the 1970s, a different cultural era, except for young boys who stayed in education longer and young mothers who stayed home with their children for longer. People actually got to work, actually worked more. Because what our current benefit system does, the universal credit with all the conditionality, etc., it beats people down. It makes them ill. To bring up, you know, some of the current debates from over the weekend, we're talking about, you know, cutting back disability benefits, which have all been slashed to the bone, sickness benefits, cutting them back further. That makes people sicker. And then they're not well enough to work. And there's actually a vicious spiral, downward spiral, where we're locking people in. Whereas, I mean, there was a recent trial, sadly cut off after 1 year because of a change of government, but a Canadian state government ran a trial. And I mean, I've seen some of the videos, people talking about what just 1 year of the UBI did for them. Some of them had their teeth fixed. One of them, and remember Canada minus 40 degrees, bought a really warm coat so they didn't just have to stay inside all winter and they could go for a walk. People were actually improving their lives, investing in themselves, and were able to then contribute. And, you know, one of the other fallacies that I talk about in the introduction is the idea that everyone has to find their identity through paid work. I mean, I was at the weekend when I was down in Leon Sea talking to one of the local Green Party members who runs a fast expanding group of community gardens. And people with mental health issues, people with illness, people with disabilities go and spend their time in the community garden, not paid, but working in the community garden, contributing to society, being valued and finding a place. And so, you know, what about if you've got a UBI and you decide you're going to start a community garden, run a community garden? You can be contributing far more to society than many of the paid jobs. And, you know, people sometimes say, but how are we going to get people to do all the really horrible jobs? And my case study for this is always sewer cleaners. And by the nature of public meetings, I once was at a public meeting and I said this and someone put their hand up and said, my mate's a sewer cleaner and he loves his job. But all right, let's assume that most people don't want to be a sewer cleaner. Maybe you have to pay people lots of money to be sewer cleaners. You actually start, you know, think back to the height of COVID. We suddenly all realized these essential workers, these low paid workers, the delivery riders and the people in shops, etc., how essential they were to our lives. Maybe we have to pay sewer cleaners a lot more than we pay bankers. I think we should pay sewer cleaners more than we pay bankers.
How do you calculate this UBI practically though? Because obviously it will impact each person differently. How do you calculate a universal amount?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Green Party, when we've done this in the past, one of the things we've had to do because, you know, as in so many things, we would like to not start from here. Don't start from here is kind of a general rule of thumb for the whole of the human race, really, but we are starting from where we are. So we actually had to split out housing benefit and treat housing benefit because obviously one of the things in the country is there's huge disparities between, we're sitting in London, between London housing costs and the rest. So a pure UBI would cover your housing as well. In the intermediate period, we split housing out. And also we maintain disability benefits. I mean, the idea of UBI is obviously it replaces job seekers allowance and those kind of, you know, the basic payments to people who can't work because of sickness. But if you're disabled, you know, disability payments, something that this government, sorry, I'm not supposed to be political, it just sneaks in occasionally. This government doesn't acknowledge is that we are a discriminatory society. You know, I was only one of the train stations I was in on the weekend, reflecting on how incredibly difficult it would be for someone in a wheelchair to get on the train, the complicated ways to get there. Our society is not accessible to many, many people for all kinds of different reasons. Wheelchairs is just the obvious one. And so disability payments acknowledge the fact that society is discriminatory. So there would still be disability payments for people who need them. We also have in previous models kept in a single parent payment because again, our society is not arranged at the moment in ways that would make it easy for people to care for children on their own. So there's some adjustments for that. But also one of the things that I haven't seen any modelling work done on this, but it's obvious, is that if everyone's got the same UBI, you know, the government talks about levelling up. I don't like the idea of levelling up because it suggests that everything should become like London. I think that's a terrible model. But nonetheless, we need to spread prosperity around the country. So you've got a UBI and, you know, let's say on Friday I'm in Hull and, you know, Hull's a pretty disadvantaged area of the country. You're an artist and you want to just live on your UBI and entirely focus on your art. You might decide to move to Hull where the rents are much cheaper. And so you would actually over time have a real levelling up effect of if you go and live somewhere cheaper, then you actually really benefit, you know, that would level out around the country, economic activity, cultural activity, all kinds of things, because that would be the advantage.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, no, I was just going to ask any questions on UBI because obviously it's been a Green Party policy for decades now.
Where does the money come from?
Okay, the shorthand for this is about half of it comes from the costs of existing benefits and also from the saving and administration of existing benefits. I mean, in terms of, you think about job seekers allowance and you think about job centres, which theoretically are supposed to be helping people into work, but are actually just policing people and spending a huge amount, you know, have you applied for you've done your 36 hours of job seeking a week and applied for 40 jobs this week? The cost of having someone check up on everybody doing that is quite large. So roughly speaking, and this is all based on, and it's not really enough, but again, we have the starting from here problem is this was set at job seekers allowance was the basic level of UBI. And so about half of it comes from your saving and your administration costs. And administering a UBI is really simple. I mean, because you just basically got to find the people and give them the money. So it's like child benefit, which used to be a universal benefit. About 1% of the cost goes in administration. So it's much cheaper to administer. It comes from the benefits. We've actually, as the Green Party, over different manifestos, drawn the money from different sources. I mean, in 2015, we very much focused on making rich individuals and multinational companies pay their taxes. In 2017, which was around about the era of the Gilets jaunes protests in France, we had, in our discussion of this, we looked at a carbon tax, a very large carbon tax, and we actually funded it through the carbon tax. In some ways, this is kind of just academic because we don't do generally hypothecated taxes in the UK. So it's a case you have to get a lot of money in to pay for it, but you don't actually link it up directly. But, you know, we have a situation now where rich individuals and multinational companies don't pay their way, and that's something that has to change. We have to slash our carbon emissions, and a carbon tax almost certainly has to be part of that. So you can look at all those different things. I mean, we are talking about a total restructuring of society here. And you know, that's why it's called Change Everything. And so this is very much you know, a foundation of reshaping things. There's also, I mean, there may be some people here who've done a lot of work on modern monetary theory. I'm not going to get into a full discussion of modern monetary theory here because it's a whole lecture in its own right. You know, the idea that the state can just create money essentially because the state can do that. This is why the total myth of the idea that, you know, the state is not like a household. It's not the case that we didn't get enough money in this month, and so we can't pay it back. That is a total fiction and nonsense. What I don't like about modern monetary theory is the job guarantee idea. For those of you who know that, I can expand on that if anyone wants to have a nice discussion about that. But the problem with the job guarantee is you're essentially going into a socialist style. Someone has to decide whether you are doing a job or not, and you're bringing back the conditionality. And the key thing about UBI is no conditionality.
Anyone else got any questions? Doesn't have to be about UBI, anything. Good.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how does things like the rise of AI and the 4-day work week and those kind of like themes and conversations link into change everything? Like, for example, they're talking about the 4-day work week and shortening the hours for people, and they're also talking about having AI replace many of the jobs, or should replace many of the hard-working jobs, but it ends up replacing many of the musicians and artists by creating art and stuff. So how does that link into the conversation? Do you address that, or is it just
yep, 4-day week to start off with, because I'm going to start with the positive.
Yeah.
Green Party, long time been championing this with the Green Party for many years. And interestingly, there was actually a global study, and there was dozens of British companies involved in it. Yeah, and nearly all the companies have stuck with it after the trial. It's actually in terms of productivity, in terms of worker retention, in terms of worker health, all kinds of things. It was massively positive. I mean, even I think it's Starling Bank, it was one of the startup banks did it. So totally agree with the 4-day working week as standard. In fact, the New Economics Foundation a few years ago did some really good work on eventually going to a 3-day week as standard. And that's where I think we should eventually be aiming. And of course, historically, Keynes thought by the 1970s we'd be working a 17-hour week, which is pretty well heading in the same direction. And I think one of the really exciting things about a 4-day week or a 3-day week is that one of the other fallacies I talk about at the start of the book is that we cannot keep having growth. You cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. And what we have to do is acknowledge that the pie can't keep getting bigger. And what's been the philosophy of both sides of politics is some people only get crumbs, but if the pie keeps getting bigger, they get a few more crumbs. And that's how you trade off to people. You know, that's the democratic story you tell to people. If the pie can't keep getting bigger, you have to slice it up more fairly. But one of the things politically that you can trade off is to say, okay, we're not going to have growth anymore. And actually, if you listen to the IMF, there is going to be no real growth in the world in the next 10 years. That's actually the reality. I was talking to the New Economics Foundation the other day about trying to get some work done on this, because we need to actually think about this. But so let's say every year we're aiming to cut the standard working week by 15 minutes. Every 4 years, you get an extra hour of life every week to do with what you want to do. No one lies on their deathbed and goes, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. We can offer people, hey, this is progress. This is a better life. You have more life, more time to do what you want to do with it. So that's the 4-day week. What was the other bit? Sorry,
AI.
AI. I wrote a thesis on artificial intelligence 23 years ago now. We're almost there. We're still almost there. ChatGPT, generative AI, is not intelligence. It's big data. And one of the interesting things is that if you think about this as a thought experiment, it's pretty obvious. If you start with a whole lot of ChatGPT documents and just run generation after generation, training them on the ChatGPT documents, very quickly you'll end up with absolute gobbledygook. You know, this the so-called you know, the lying, the way it just makes things up. The fact that it has there is no understanding. There is not a single slightest skerrick of intelligence there. I mean, my thesis 20 years ago was you know, arguing that if we ever do have AI, it will have to be embodied. We have an intelligence that comes, you know, I know so much about that table from just laying my hand on that table. Something that if you're not embodied, you cannot know what that table feels like. So sorry, I can go well off into that, but I won't. But so I don't think that AI is going to be replacing as many jobs as people think. I mean, there are lots of tech bro types who basically say, oh, we've got to have UBI because there's not going to be any jobs because it's all AI. I think that's a total nonsense. And I think we've been through a cycle of this with outsourcing. You may recall, I mean, this still happens to some degree, but you know, there was a phase 25 years ago. I actually was a rapporteur at a economist conference in Bangkok. It was all about, we're going to outsource all of our call centers and everything. And they did that. And then they found that actually people ringing up and talking to someone on the other side of the world with a slightly scanty grasp of English, just reading a script out to them with no understanding, didn't really result in very good customer service. In fact, there was a lot of, and so, you know, there's a lot of, oh, we're going to replace all our call center staff with AIs. I think we all know what that's like. You know, machine voice. What do you want to do? I want to do this. Do you want to do that? No, I want to do this.
To be fair, I mean, there's a lot of AI that's being integrated in like big tech that's very different to that. Like that ChatGPT is a chatbot, like, and it's not artificial intelligence to the scale that like we are going to be seeing it implemented, I think.
I mean, I think it's deeply dangerous, and you know, I've been doing a lot of work on the House of Lords on these areas, much as I can. I've got lots of balls in the air, but I'd like to do more, because of course we know that, I mean, it's still not intelligence, it's only big data, but the algorithms are deeply discriminatory. You know, they reflect the society, the data they've been trained on, and you know, the Green Party generally has been very concerned about facial recognition software. And we know that it's very bad of people from minoritized communities, because it's basically been trained on internet data of a whole lot of Americans from universities, etc. So, you know, it's deeply discriminatory against people from minoritized communities. Australia had a huge disaster whereby they used essentially AI to find out when people were cheating on their benefits. And it ended up robbing a lot of people of money they were owed, and eventually they had to pay lots of people a great deal of compensation, because the AI doesn't understand human circumstances. And if you can actually, you know, still sit down in the job centre and explain to someone what's happening in your life, there's at least some chance that person will have enough agency to be able to acknowledge that, yes, you really do need those benefits. But the AI has no grasp of that at all. And if you're outside the norm, if you're outside the pattern the AI has been trained into, then goodness help you.
So you're against AI?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think it is AI. You know, I would challenge any idea that this is intelligence. And I'm not saying, you know, there's some really interesting, there's so much work needs to be done on this. I mean, one of the areas where there undoubtedly is some kind of place for it is medicine. And say, you know, the big data is being run over all your, you know, mammography scans. But there is actually some research that's showing it's still not better than a human. Humans are still better at it. Now, you then get into a tricky situation. Of course, we have a shortage of human resources that I was talking about. You know, it may, if you have no human who can look at those scans, then your big data is better than nothing if you can't look at the scans otherwise. So it's a matter of making a judgment about what resources you have available. But the key thing is using it thoughtfully. Far too often it's been treated as though it was a, you know, it's essentially been treated like magic. I mean, I'm just having a flash in my head. It's kind of, it's a distant anecdote, but I think it kind of relates. Boris Johnson once wrote a column for the Telegraph of being pro-fracking. And he said in this column, this is more or less word for word, well, I don't really understand what it works or what's happening, but it must be a good thing, so let's have it. And there's an awful lot of that approach being taken to AI. People who have no real understanding go, there's this magic thing that will fix things. And, you know, magical thinking is a really, really bad idea. It's always a bad idea. And as human beings, you know, we're in tune. And the other thing is, of course, lots of people are making lots of money out of this at the moment. It's in their interest to talk it up and talk it up. We're kind of in a tulip mania. It's about time we got past tulip manias, really.
Speaking of the algorithm, what are your thoughts on social media and the growth of it and how it's integrated in so many of our lives now?
I'm actually relatively a social media optimist. Part of this comes from, if the Green Party hadn't taken over my life, I would by now have written 4 books on the history of the women of London. That was what I was doing before the Green Party took over my life. And I got quite into the Civil War. And if you start to study the English Civil War, you'll realise that we think social media, you know, people are saying really horrible things on social media now. And they're being really nasty to each other. And it's never been like this before. You study the English Civil War and look at some of the pamphlets that were being published and were being like pasted up on the walls of London, just down the road from here. They were saying things that you'd even get blocked on Twitter for now, even now. You know, politics has always been a nasty game, and when things get hot, they get heated. So I don't really believe that, you know, there's anything new in social media. What's really crucial is we have to give people we come back to education, the critical education skills, the critical thinking skills, the media literacy skills. And again, we come back to Finland, and Finland does this really well. People need to be able to look at something and say, do I believe that or not? Does that look believable? You know, we're not going to stop deep fakes, but what we have to do is equip people to look at the thing. Do I really believe that that person would have said that? You know, and the problem is, of course, that it's really hard for you to be a teacher in one lesson going, right, we're preparing for the exam. These are the 10 things you have to recite in the exam to get top marks. Just learn these and regurgitate them. Right, now we're doing a media literacy lesson. You've got to critically question everything that's put in front of you. But we've got to, again, we come back to education, we've got to deal with that. But I also think that we have to acknowledge that social media has huge possibilities. You know, anybody can now make a video that goes multi-viral. I mean, my most viral social media post ever was totally unexpected. I took a photo of a train carriage in Finland, and it was actually children in the train carriage was a children's playground, sort of meant for kids up to 6 or 7 or so. And I just tweeted this, you know, took a photo, tweeted it, said, what a great idea. and it reached millions of people around the world because it just went viral. Caroline Russell, who I added in the tweet because she was our transport spokesperson at the time, has never quite forgiven me because her feed just filled up with all of this. But so it has the potential to also share really good ideas, and for subaltern ideas from below to actually get shared. You know, there's a possibility for, it's not easy and it doesn't happen very often, but someone in Bangladesh could share something and it could just take off. And you know, mainstream media is, of course, and the ownership of mainstream media is one of our big problems. Media ownership reform is something I was only talking about in the House the other day. But actually, there's a profound democracy in social media, which, of course, our current arrangements of social media squash and don't work with very well. But it's possible to arrange social media differently. And even with our current arrangements, stuff bubbles up and has impact. So, you know, anyone in this room can make the great video for UBI and make it go viral. It'll probably have some kittens in it. This is my little tip.
Yeah, exactly. I think we could talk about social media all day because obviously the flip side is your message can go out to millions of people around the world. If that message is negative, filled with hate, that is a massive concern compared to, say, a pamphlet you stick on a wall. You need an individual to actually go past, register it, see it. Whereas now, you know, with a click of a button, you could have hateful messages, you know, exploding across the world. And we're hearing a lot about cyberbullying as well and how that's manifesting in young people's lives. So there is a massive concern at the moment with social media that there is, potential for good, but also potential for great harm.
But I think, you know, the bullying is, I mean, you know, I'm greatly concerned about it, and there's some horrendous outcomes. But, you know, if you live in an environment like, you know, a really repressive school environment that essentially bullies you, we know that people who are bullied then tend to bully others. You know, let's create a different shape of society. Let's not blame individuals. Let's look at how the whole society is working.
And I suppose last question for me, obviously a lot of the ideas discussed come from, they need to come from power, right? To implement the UBI or, you know, education for life. What are small things that we could all potentially do in our day-to-day lives to make a difference?
Well, I mean, you know, this is the one message I'd like everyone to leave with, as I say to all audiences. The key thing to understand is that we can all make a difference every day. And politics should be what everyone does, not have done to them. And that kind of, I started off by talking about how people feel disempowered and they can't change things. Doing politics might be organising a litter pick on your street. Doing politics might be organising a campaign in SOAS to get some of the plastic out of the canteen. I just saw the eyebrows raised there. I'm sure there's lots of plastic in the canteen. So getting to, you know, politics is getting together with your classmates, your neighbours, your friends, your family, whoever, and organising to make things better. And the crucial thing that does is it takes away the sense of powerlessness that's so pervasive at the moment. And I visited a school near Leicester. It was a middle school, so I only went to GCSE, Catholic school, quite small C conservative. And I was there and I visited the school council and they were absolutely cock-a-hoop because they just won the right for girls to wear trousers. And I kind of had to restrain myself from thumping my head on the desk and asking what century we were in as an old feminist. But I didn't do that. I just listened to them, and they were so cock-a-hoop and so excited, and they just won a victory and they didn't have cold ankles in winter anymore. And their next campaign was to get the right to use their mobile phones at lunchtime. I wasn't quite so sure about that one, but the important thing was they'd identified what mattered to them, and they knew that they could change the world, their world. And so to get that across to people, I mean, if we go back to the Brexit referendum, the slogan, the emotion that won that was take back control. And people have not felt in control of their own lives, their own communities. And there's so many things, you know, a few multinational companies dominating our economy, forcing the people to act like robots in Amazon warehouses. The fact that Boris Johnson got 100% of the power with 44% of the vote in 2019. The fact that so much money and resources, the power is concentrated in Westminster, and local communities don't have the power to decide for themselves. They don't have the resources to provide a library or to provide the social care that you needed, all of those things. So giving people the sense that they can take back control of their own lives, that politics is something that everyone should do. And this is where we come back to the 4-day week, because a 4-day week would give people more time and energy to actually be able to do that. I mean, I sit in lots of rooms like this, you know, on a Thursday evening in a village hall somewhere, and I say to the mostly female audience in front of me, right, go out and make politics what you do. And, you know, you see the heads drop, and it's like they're thinking, well, there's the childcare and the elder care, and I'm volunteering at the school, and you want me to do more stuff? So let's free up the human resources and the time, and let's all do politics. And just one final thought, you know, as a Green, you know, often get accused of finger waving and saying, oh, you know, you're saying I shouldn't do this or I shouldn't do that. Well, I'm not concerned with individual behaviour. I want to make the environmentally and socially responsible thing to do the easiest, cheapest and simplest thing to do. I know some people who, you know, will cycle an hour across town so that they can buy the one bottle that hasn't got plastic lining in top of the metal lid, and they've saved, you know, this much plastic. Well, I'd actually rather they spent that 2 hours of cycling time campaigning to change the system, working with others to see how we could reduce it for everybody, not say you have to cycle an hour and a half back and forth across town just to get rid of that little bit of plastic. System change, not climate change, is a chant I've said on many a street. But what we have to do is change the system. So I have to change everything.
Anyone got any more questions for Natalie?
Yeah,
Is
so,
that
this is a bit of a deep one as well, but when you say, like, you know, we have to change the system and stuff, and for example, you know, tackling the climate, the global warming problem stuff, how do you tackle it? Because things like climate change and, you know, all of these problems are very interrelated internationally as well, and there's so much division internationally. We can't get the international community to, for example, agree on, like, you know, or stick to climate commitments, for example, you know, to get them to, you know, agree to the Paris Climate Accord was, you know, a voluntary thing, and then half of them aren't even doing anything. So it feels like, you know, say if we manage to turn Britain into a green utopia where, you know, we're 100%, you know, emission free, but, you know, somewhere in, like, on the other side of the world, they're polluting crazily and stuff, and they won't change because, you know, of X, Y, Z, and they've got political conflicts, you know, here. How I feel like, you know, like you said, the efforts without change and, you know, systematic change, you know, we won't do anything. So how do we, like, do we need to extend that internationally, and how do we do that internationally, because it's so divided at the moment?
The last two chapters I'll have to point you to are actually on international geopolitics and reparations. But in shorthand, it's essentially sending the same model globally. And I think what's really important, I mean, at the moment, I was also saying this on LBC at 7 AM last week, saying let's not just reflexively increase defence spending. Let's think about diplomacy, development aid, all these things as a complete package. How do we make a more secure world, which also, of course, has to be a world that produces vastly less carbon emissions, does vastly less to trash nature, etc. We talk all the time, and, you know, the entire British effort is focused on Russia, China, US, sort of Europe. There's a whole majority world out there, the rest of the world. And what I'm focused on, practically speaking, is particularly we need to think about building international alliances. And indeed, there was a report out recently talking about, you know, us with other middle-ranking countries. A case study of what I'm talking about here, I'm doing a lot of work on antimicrobial resistance at the moment, because there's actually a UN General Assembly high-level meeting in September on antimicrobial resistance. And so I hosted at the House, Barbados and Bangladesh hosted with me an event to help smaller countries get them together to thinking about to contribute to this antimicrobial resistance. Let's think about all the, not just focus on the superpowers or the near superpowers, the major forces. Let's actually think about getting countries together. And the book finishes by talking about nuclear weapons, because of course, we're talking about the climate emergency, the nature crisis, AMR, they're all threats to our existence. Nuclear weapons are a very, very major threat to our existence. The majority of the world's countries, 123 countries, have signed up to the global ban on nuclear weapons. All of those countries are being menaced by a handful of countries that have nuclear weapons. Let's build the force of the collective politics of the world saying, we're not going to take this. It's like, how do we put pressure on Russia? And how we're doing it wrong is just utterly illustrated by the Russia's attack on Ukraine and the global reaction to it. Large parts of Africa, large parts of the global south, many countries, not just the governments, but the peoples, don't see the Ukraine war as the clear-cut moral case that it actually is. This is a case where Russia, as a utterly unprovoked, unjustified, attacked a neighbouring country and tried to seize it. But because we're on the side of Ukraine, lots of the world doesn't really trust that story. And this is also comes back to why we need to have reparations now, the impacts of colonialism, loss and damage payments through CAP. We have to think of the world as, again, like we have to think of all the people contributing. We have to think of all the countries in the world contributing to different structures. And if you think about it, Barbados, for example, who happens to have a very powerful female leader, has had real impacts. Little tiny country, a small population. We encourage, support what British diplomacy should be focused on is supporting those kind of efforts around the world. And being humble, acknowledging that we're not a superpower. We have resources because, we have the English language, which is how most of the world speaks to each other. We have the network of embassies. We have, in fact, a lot of the global media is still focused on London. Let's try and use some of those things for good. Save all the damage we've done over centuries.
Yes, my only concern is, sorry, just follow on to that. These ideas are like really good and stuff. It's just that a lot of people, a lot of countries, how do you convince them to, because they're all thinking about their own interests. They're all very, state-centric. They're all thinking about their own problems. Like if you go to, say, Pakistan and India and say, hey, we should focus more on this, climate and, there's drug resistance and stuff. But they're like, I'm too busy about, Kashmir, and they're focusing on, they've got military dictatorship in one part and military dictatorship, but and they've got all these problems that they put the climate agenda last. And my only concern is that, like, we've all seen the reports that we've got like until 2030 or or 2050 maximum before our planet goes to 1.5 degrees higher before it becomes bust essentially, and then we'll have even bigger problems in terms of like climate migration and stuff. So even if we slowly start picking up those ideas, like over generation, like a generation divide or something, will it be like, I'm worried that it's going to be too late by the time we get there before with some irreparable damage. Is that, how do we get the message out then quickly to people? Like,
well, I think somewhere like Pakistan, which was essentially a couple of years ago, had 50% under flood water as the result of the climate emergency. I mean, there is actually acute awareness of this. Yeah. What we actually have to do is give people a means. Pakistan needs a huge amount of support for climate adaptation. And we also have to give them the chance to have a decent life. So that means loss and damage payments through COP, etc. But ultimately, the underlying argument for this is the same all around the world. Is no country is an island, even countries that are islands, because the only thing that makes every country secure is a stable world. And so, lots of these things, as Greens, we've traditionally made the moral argument for overseas development assistance. We've made the moral argument for disarmament, etc. But actually, there's a very powerful argument from security. a couple of year or so back, spent a fascinating year embedded with the British military under the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. And boy, the military understands the climate emergency is a real threat and the need to take action. Look at this, look at security holistically. No one is made more secure by guns or, goodness help us, nuclear weapons. A stable climate, a world in which no one's going hungry, that's true security.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, go for it.
So in response to what you're saying, Salome, I just think that that's quite a complex argument if you're looking at like a global geopolitical system where the global north are responsible for really the climate catastrophe that we're seeing. So I think like to then put that kind of, well, what are these other countries going to do about it? Like I don't think it's their responsibility at this point. Well, I think it has to be everybody, but I think that that's a sensitive topic. Really.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I wasn't trying to suggest that it's like, one person's, it's like, that the global north hasn't, done damage to like the global south and everything. I was just more worried about like, for example, it's that everyone's focus is like, it's a very realist world we live in terms of like, as in realism in terms of like, that power politics and stuff, and they would put that interest first over the collective interest. So for example, like the USA can just pull out of the climate, accords, and then it kind of just undermines everything. And what's going on, for example, in the Middle East, they prioritize all of their interests first. And I was just worried that it's how do I put this, the pursuit of self-interest by all countries, because that's where they're sort of like, that's the sort of model that we've modeled the world on and stuff, will sort of like end up, yeah, it would just because it requires collective action, doesn't it, to solve the climate problem. But
I'm going to throw in the positive message of hope here, because this is my job in life, to throw in the positive message of hope, which is, the thing is, where we are now is profoundly unstable. That's true economically, environmentally, educationally, socially, politically. And that's good news, because where we are now is really, really, really terrible. And whether it's geopolitics or whether it's our internal politics, things are not going to continue as they are, and that's really good news. And to turn this around the other way, imagine a little thought experiment. Imagine we created a near perfect society, a utopia, a world where everything's going fine and dandy. Everyone's got a nice, stable home, a good job if you want it, really good levels of mental and physical health. And then the scientists come out and go, oh, we've discovered there's a climate emergency. You're going to have to change everything now because of the climate emergency. Now, that would be really politically difficult. Where we are now, all of the climate action and the nature action, all the other things, it's not people or planet. It's not, oh, the economy or the environment. The economy is a complete subset of the environment. Every country exists in a world where more instability, whether it's climate or geopolitical, makes it worse for that country. So things are going to change. That's one thing I can absolutely guarantee everyone in this room, is we're going to see a massive amount of change in the next 10 years. And, I don't know that it's going to work out. Of course I don't, because history is not pre-written. It's maybe where I run away from some of the more extreme Marxists. History is not pre-written. It's made by the actions of people. So that's why everyone needs to get out and do politics.
Thank you, Natalie. Well, with that note, we can all go out. Everyone is inspired. Sandra, shall I let you take over?
Well, just wanted to thank everyone for being here. Thank you both for such an insightful discussion. Just want to encourage you all to stay in touch with ICOP and up to date with our events. If you follow our Twitter, SOS ICOP. We're actually hosting a panel, panel series right now on Palestine. And our next event is on the media's coverage of Gaza, for those of you that might be interested. But yeah, just thank you all again once again for being here. Thank you to our online attendants as well. And if there are any other questions, then hopefully you guys can talk at the end of this, but thank you so much, and thanks to the panel.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions of this.
You have your copies of your book.
Indeed, yes.
For people.